Hi there. As you see, I'm Conservation Manager for the Imperial War Museum, one of the two Conservation Managers for the War Museum. My colleague Emma looks after the small objects, I look after the large objects. And large object is defined as anything that won't fit on somebody else's desk, usually lands on mine. Now, I love discussions about ethics because the word you very rarely hear in the introduction is reality. We all know what we'd like to do, but reality tends to dictate what we can do. It's not going. Oh, right. Airplane here, B-17, 104 foot wide, I don't know, about 60 foot long, 10, 15 tons, something like that. Big beast. We had problems with it. We had corrosion in it. We had the aircraft was restored in the 80s by a very good team working to the standards of the day. Now, the chances of us getting an object like this in pristine original condition are zero. Nowadays, it just does not happen. That's how it came to us. The aircraft was built in late 1945, never saw combat, was sold to an airline, used as an airliner for a while. The nose area where the bomb aimer and the navigator would sit, still with the plexiglass dome, was actually a cocktail bar. They took out gun positions and put in windows and all sorts of things, modified it. It was then sold to the French government, who used it for aerial survey work. So they then modified it again. It was, oh no, sorry, between then, it was used by the Assemblies of God to deliver Bibles and missionaries. I'm assuming by landing and letting them out and not just dropping them from the bomb bay. And that's the rear end of it. Then it went to the French. Then it came to the UK as a Christmas tree for a flying B-17. So it was gutted and stripped out then as well. So there's not really a lot original left before we even start. So this is where we start coming down to the ethical side. Yes, we will obviously preserve what we can of the original, but then we've got to start going, my aim is towards authenticity, so we can tell the real story. An extreme purist would say, well, leave the aircraft like that and tell that story. But that doesn't fit in with the remit of the museum I work for. We need to tell the story of these bombers. So, excuse me. It's a complex structure. This is a relatively simple part of a flat shroud that goes at the end of the back of the wing. That's an easy bit. You can see what we're dealing with here. The aircraft has spent a lot of time out in the open air. We've got corrosion here, there, and everywhere. It was never designed to have a long life. It was designed to last 6 months if you were lucky. It was either shot out of the air or war-weary. So no corrosion protection was applied to it in service. In fact, they weren't even painted externally coming the end of the war. This is one of the things we've had to do to modify back. This is starboard waist gun position. This was taken out completely and windows put in. So when it was reworked in the 80s, they wanted to put the gun positions back. So this is a completely new skin. I won't bore you with too many sad person bits and pieces, but even the rivets here are wrong. These are English rivets, these are original ones are American. Nowadays we would source American and we would use the original. But having said that, I'm not criticising the guys in the 80s. They did a very good job with very limited resources, and when I'm teaching I always advise people not to be too critical of your predecessors, because it won't be too long before you're the predecessor. So you can see we've got a lot of work on our hands here. So where do we go? Do we preserve the airplanes? Now this was painted, as I say, it stood outside a long time. That's the lower surface of a wing. You can see the extent of that corrosion. I've got very little choice there but to remove that corrosion if I want to preserve the object for any length of time. All right, this is an extreme case, but we had surface corrosion over just about 100% of that aircraft skin area. Wings, fuselage, fin, the lot. The only bits that weren't corroded were the fabric-covered flying control surfaces. They were a different problem because they were rotten and damaged, so they had to be repaired. That is the extent. Clean bit, dirty bit. That's the sort of work we had to do. People have said, well, you should leave it, just stabilise it. Oh, this is where we come back to reality. Let's get real. It doesn't work like that on large industrial objects. It would be lovely if we could. We have aircraft and vehicles in the collection that have come straight from service in the paint scheme they saw service in. So yes, we've got something to work with. We will try and preserve that original. Something like this, there is no original paint because no paint was originally applied. But I've got to look on paint as a conservation treatment to preserve the object for a longer period. And that's when we come into the debate about, excuse me, what colour scheme do we do? What's the history of the airplane? This is a cockpit. There was nothing in it when we got it. If we're going to tell the story of these objects, we've got to put it back to something we can work with. I've just realised I've got my pictures in here. Mr. IT here. As you can see, it's really complex. People then say, well, distress it so it looks real. Well, you can't just distress something like this. I've never seen an industrial object that's been restored or conserved and then deliberately distressed to look right. It doesn't happen. This is what happens in service, not in a workshop. Plus, of course, trying to source all these bits, difficult. And then we get the legal requirements. A lot of these instruments are radioactive. Yeah. What happened to the 6-minute wave? So you didn't let me watch.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah.
One sentence sum up.
We keep this sort of thing. This is original decals. We do keep those when we come across them.
Okay, thanks very much. Do you just want to wait there while we do the response, just in case you want to come back? Jane, would you like to respond to that presentation?
Well, I think that's absolutely lovely because it brings in this whole question of the story straight away, the narrative. And I think that, you've asked the question, does one story have more value than another? And probably it's the definition of the story that defines the concept of original, all of which makes me wonder, is it even the conservator's job or the role of conservation ethics to be defining those things? Because most of your decisions flow from those things, but is that really our place to... Should that be our decision to define the story? The other thing I thought that really jumps out at, I'm sure everybody in the audience, is the role of knowledge. You know which rivet, your rivets. Yeah, and I don't.
I've got a life as well.
Yeah, we were conservators. We know that's not true. But the knowledge that you have and the knowledge you have of the way things are done, this is not how things are done. That's an incredibly important feature in conservation decision making and in ethics, I think. So they're more open statements, really.
Okay. Do you want to?
I think that is. I agree with you. It's not the conservator's decision, or it's not the conservator's sole decision. They have input because they have the knowledge of the object. I'm fortunate at Duxford we don't have curators. Mm-hmm. The collections manager, the conservation manager, research and interpretation, and our head of department are effectively the curator.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we work as a committee.
Okay, that's interesting. So I want to open out to the audience for comments or questions. Anybody? It's a big subject area. We've talked about authenticity, multiple histories, access versus preservation. Does anybody wish to respond? Could you give your name, please, for the record?
All right, then, Simon. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Diane Gwilt, Keeper of Collection Services at the National Museum of Wales. And just for Jane's benefit, I was trying really hard not to ask the first question. Okay. Oh, no, not to make the first comment. But what I would like to pick up on is the point you made, Chris. In your narrative, you talked about when you were talking about the cockpit, and you made reference to preserving the sort of history of the service of the aircraft, which kind of links back into Jane's point about actually with these large industrial kind of, or if I can call it industrial sort of artefacts, there's an interesting debate about actually what it is you're preserving. Is it important to preserve every single example of what you've got, or is it actually the issue that you're preserving something because it represents the technological development is actually what the important thing is? So I think it's very interesting that you made reference to the fact that recording the fact that it was the way it was because it had been in service, and actually how recording that played a part in your or should recording that. Is it the object, or is it the kind of story it has to tell that we're preserving?
That's a good one, because we know the limited history of this particular object. There's very little of the original object left. So we are trying to preserve the story, and it's almost a prop to tell that story. Maybe I should say an aid to display to tell that story.
Diane, do you want to respond?
Absolutely, Chris, but I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think that's a really interesting dilemma, and I think it's a really interesting point, and I think it's about thinking about, this is effectively what we're discussing today, the wider issues around conservation, that it's not just about working with an object, although you need knowledge of an object to do that. It's actually about what is the point, fundamentally.
It's easy as conservators, my view is it's easy as conservators to end up focusing on the object and forgetting the wider museum. Why are we there? We're there to tell the story about people. We all know the various quotes. But it's easy to get tunnel vision on the object we're working on. I mean, I could have done a lot more on this particular aircraft. But it comes back to reality. I've got 8 full-time members of staff to look after 107 aircraft and about 200 vehicles, and a variety of other things that keep cropping up. I can only do so much with what I've got. Yes, I'd love more staff, I'd love more time, I'd love more money, and I don't know anyone that works in a museum that wouldn't agree with that. But it is difficult.
Okay, does anybody wish to respond to that? Because from my point of view, we've heard Chris mention this reality several times, time and money, and we all work within those constraints. But surely a code of ethics should be able to take account of those issues, because ethics shouldn't just be about resources. I mean, I've just been looking at the Venice Charter 1964, thinking about sources and where our ideas of ethics come from. A couple of key points from the Charter are preserve and reveal the aesthetic and historical value is one line, respect for original material and authentic documents, and I think you've managed to do both of those within the work you're doing. But then the third point was stop at the point where conjecture begins. And I think the challenge with this kind of work is what is conjecture and how are you going to use it? And I think there's something that we're probably going to come back to throughout the day, because it's this complex issues of authenticity. What is authentic and how do we represent that? I mean, the interesting point I thought you raised was about someone suggesting you should patinate or distress an object to make it look...
It just doesn't work.
So you would rather have it back in there being as an obvious replacement?
I would rather have it back. For example, this particular aircraft, we've repainted it, and we've got runs in the paint, we've got mismatch in the colour, because, well, that's what happens when you're spraying an airplane.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it would have been like when it came out the factory. We haven't tried to make it something special. I constantly get enthusiasts saying, it's a beautiful machine, it should be seen in the air, blah, 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 blah. Airplanes were designed to fly. Well, this one was designed to rain death and destruction. How far back do you want to go on the design principles?
And Bibles.
And Bibles. Well, it managed Bibles. But one of the problems I do get is convincing staff, because we've got limited resources, to stabilise an object rather than maybe go as far as they would like.
Mm-hmm.
So that hopefully one day in the future we might have the resources
mm-hmm.
to do it as they would prefer. But stabilising seems to be a very difficult one to get across to a lot of people.
Dave, it's going to have to be a very, very quick point.
Okay, well, I'll start talking after we've gone loud. You mentioned... Sorry, who are you? I was interested here. You mentioned sourcing rivets.
Dave, just give us your...
Dave Watkinson. For the record. Yeah, you mentioned sourcing rivets from the USA, and I mean the majority of the talk was about a visual construct in terms of ethics, and I just wondered, the mention from Simon when you mentioned the Charter was also about materials. And I wondered about this sourcing of rivets from America. What happens in an instance where, for the survival of the aircraft, in terms of, say, galvanic couples on rivets, you can do a better job than in the past? So would you go for an original rivet?
I would go for an original rivet because they're easy to get.
Okay.
You can get them, they're standard parts.
Okay, we can come back to that bit. There's a very interesting question, this idea of materials. We're going to have to come back to it, so we need to move on. Thank you for that.